I still remember the first time it really hit me, the silence after she left my apartment that night. I'd asked her, casually at first, if she wanted to meet my kids. Just as simple, would you like to come over next weekend? Her eyes went flat, like she'd been punched in the chest, and she just shook her head. No explanation, no hesitation, just a quiet refusal. At first, I thought it was nerves. Maybe she wasn't ready to step into that part of my life. I told myself that. But as days passed, the refusal lingered like a shadow. Every time I mentioned them, even in passing, her expression tightened. Her smile became smaller, more careful. And I started noticing little things, the way she avoided their photos on my phone. The way she never asked about their school projects or soccer games. I tried to push it aside, reasoning that maybe some things just couldn't be rushed. But deep down, a knot of confusion started to form, twisting tighter every time I caught myself hoping she'd suddenly change her mind. And then, one night, I stumbled across something I wasn't supposed to see, that made me question everything I thought I knew about her. I remember that night like it was a live wire stretched across my chest. I'd asked her, casually, if she wanted to meet my kids. Just a weekend dinner. Nothing fancy. Her response didn't come in words. It came in the way her body stiffened, how she pulled her hand back like she'd burned it, and that flat, unreadable stare that made the air between us feel suddenly heavy. I laughed nervously at first, trying to mask the sting. "It's okay," I said. "No pressure. I just thought. You know." But the words felt hollow, even to me. She nodded slowly, barely, and left. The door clicked behind her, and the silence that followed was worse than any argument I'd ever had. It wasn't angry silence. It was empty, like something inside her had just folded in on itself. For the next few days, I replayed it over and over. Every time I mentioned my kids, my daughter's new school project, my son's soccer game, her reaction was the same. A small, almost imperceptible tightness around her eyes. A hesitation before she spoke. And I noticed myself flinching, waiting for the moment her patience would snap. Even though she never did, I started watching for patterns. She avoided my phone when I showed pictures, quietly shifted the conversation when I talked about their routines, and sometimes just froze mid-sentence when a story about them came up. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining it. That she just wasn't used to kids in her life yet. But the more I watched, the more I couldn't ignore the hollow feeling that had settled in my chest. Late one night, I found myself standing in the kitchen, staring at the empty countertop and thinking, why is this so hard? Why can't she just say yes or no? Why does every little word about my children seem to make her disappear a little more? I didn't have answers. I only had the silence. And it was growing louder with every passing day. I thought maybe tomorrow would be different. Maybe she'd change her mind. But even as I drifted off to sleep that night, I felt it, the faint, creeping weight of knowing that something about her refusal wasn't just about timing or nerves. Something about it was bigger. And I had no idea what. Before all this confusion, things had felt normal. Ordinary, even. I could almost forget the knot in my chest that night she refused to meet my kids. We had routines that were small but comforting, coffee on the balcony in the morning, walking through the quiet streets after dinner, laughing over dumb movies we both pretended to hate. When I met her, I thought she was effortless. Easy to talk to, patient with my quirks, warm in a way that made the apartment feel smaller but cozier. She didn't rush anything, didn't push too hard, and I liked that. It made me feel safe. I started imagining a life where she was part of the everyday, not just fleeting moments. The kids were always in the background. I'd talk about their weekend adventures casually, show a picture on my phone, mention a story from school, and usually she would smile, nod, or ask a small question. But over time, I noticed the difference in her reactions. She wouldn't reach for my phone when I handed it to her. Her eyes would glance past the photos, landing somewhere in the room as if she'd just remembered something urgent she needed to do. And sometimes, just sometimes, she'd pause mid-sentence, frown slightly, and shake it off like a hiccup. I caught myself rationalizing it. Maybe she was shy around kids. Maybe she didn't know what to say. Maybe she needed more time. That was comforting, at least. It let me pretend that nothing was wrong. And for a while, I clung to it. I reminded myself of the dinners we shared, the late-night talks that stretched into laughter and quiet confessions. I tried to balance my worry with the evidence that nothing about her, nothing at all, suggested she disliked my children, but the small gestures kept appearing. The way she never asked about school projects, the way she would shift when my kids' laughter echoed through the apartment when they were over with me. And it was subtle. Almost invisible if you weren't paying attention. But I noticed. And even if I couldn't articulate it yet, a tiny voice in my head whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was more than shyness or unfamiliarity. By the time we settled into the rhythm of ordinary life again, I found myself holding my breath around her. Not because I feared confrontation, but because I wanted to see a glimmer of the warmth I felt when she laughed at something I said or shared a quiet, unspoken understanding. I wanted to see that same warmth when it came to my kids. And when it wasn't there, I started to notice it, noticing the gaps, the silences, the little absences that made her presence feel incomplete. I think the thing I underestimated most was how much I wanted to trust her. Not in a naive way, at least, I told myself it wasn't naive, but in that deep, unshakable way where you let someone into the quiet corners of your life without thinking twice. I shared details I'd never told anyone else. My insecurities, the petty fights I had with my ex, the little victories with my kids that no one else cared about. And she listened. Really listened, late nights, when the apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing outside, we'd talk about everything. She'd lean back on the couch, arms draped over the cushions, and I'd watch the way her fingers traced the patterns in the fabric absent-mindedly. Her lips curling slightly when something amused her. In those moments, I felt safe. I felt like I could reveal pieces of myself I'd been hiding for years, and maybe that's why it hit so hard when I noticed the subtle walls around my children. I wasn't used to people holding back from me, and I certainly wasn't used to someone holding back from them. When she declined to meet them that first night, I pushed it aside. When she avoided photos or quieted when I spoke about their day, I rationalized it. She's just learning how to fit into our life, I told myself. She's not used to kids yet. She'll come around. But trust isn't built on assumptions, it's built on observation. And little by little, the observations started to stack. She wouldn't ask how my daughter's art project was going, even when I lingered on the story. She would redirect conversations about my son's soccer games, her smile polite but distant. I remember one evening she laughed at something I said, but I could tell she was only half present, her mind somewhere else. And I didn't know why. Still, I held on to trust. I held on to the version of her I wanted to see. I reminded myself of the shared breakfasts, the movies, the quiet nights filled with unspoken understanding. I told myself that love is patience, and patience is the bridge over all gaps. I convinced myself that eventually, she'd meet them. She'd laugh at their jokes. Roll her eyes at their childish antics, maybe even scold them gently if they crossed a line. I was patient. Too patient, maybe. And that patience, the part of me that believed in her, was also the part that ignored the growing shadow, the tiny signals I couldn't interpret. The way her eyes would shift, the way her tone would tighten for no reason I could name. I told myself she was fine. That she'd adjust. That one day, all the silence would dissolve into the laughter I was waiting for, but even as I said those things to myself, a quiet, nagging thought started to creep in during the smallest moments, while washing dishes, while walking home from work, while staring at an empty chair beside me. It was a whisper, barely audible, but persistent. What if it's not just nerves? What if I've been wrong all along? It started small, almost invisible, like a shadow stretching across the edge of a room. She would make excuses for why she couldn't come over when the kids were around, citing work or errands that never quite lined up. At first, I accepted it. But then the excuses began to feel rehearsed, like lines she repeated without thinking about the truth behind them. One evening, I was scrolling through my phone, laughing at a video my son had sent me of his soccer practice, when I noticed her glance at it. Her expression didn't change, not exactly, but her fingers tightened around her cup. She didn't ask who it was, didn't comment, didn't even look away long enough to register curiosity. I wanted to chalk it up to nothing. I wanted to tell myself she was tired, distracted. But something in me didn't let go. There were other little things. A message she hid too quickly when I glanced at her phone. A sigh that felt like it carried more weight than casual frustration. The way she would change the subject when my daughter's school recital came up, even if it was months away. At first, I rationalized each moment. Everyone has quirks. Everyone has moments of discomfort, but the shadows kept stacking. One weekend, I suggested a casual lunch with the kids. She hesitated so long before answering that the air between us felt thick, almost electric. And then she smiled, yes, but it didn't reach her eyes. It was a practiced smile. Polite and flat, as if she were performing for me. I remember sitting across from her, watching her fingers trace the edge of her napkin, and feeling a quiet chill creep through me. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every little interaction from the past few weeks. Every subtle glance, every half smile, every hesitation. I kept telling myself I was overthinking. I kept telling myself she wasn't ready. But the doubt had started its slow work, digging under my confidence and planting seeds that would grow whether I wanted them to or not, and yet, I couldn't bring myself to confront her. Not directly. Not yet. There was a strange tension in the thought of asking why. Like I would somehow shatter something fragile if I did. So I let the questions circle in my head, circling tighter with every passing day. The silence became heavier, more insistent, and the shadows felt closer. I didn't know it then, but these small, unspoken cracks were only the beginning. They were hints of a deeper truth, one I couldn't see yet, one I wasn't prepared to face. And that, I think, made it all the more terrifying. It was a rainy afternoon when I first stumbled across what I thought would explain everything. I was tidying up the living room, shoving magazines into a basket, when I noticed a small notebook tucked under the couch cushion. I didn't recognize it at first. Its leather cover was worn, and the pages smelled faintly of coffee and something else, something familiar but hard to place. I hesitated. I shouldn't have opened it. I knew that. But curiosity has a way of feeling like permission. The pages were filled with handwritten entries, quick sentences, messy scrawls. Most of it was mundane, shopping lists, reminders, little doodles. But then I found sections that made my stomach twist. Lines about being scared of commitment, about being too fragile to deal with children, about wanting closeness but fearing failure. I read them over and over, my heart thumping so loud I thought she'd hear it through the walls, and in that moment, it all made sense, or at least, I thought it did. Her avoidance of my kids wasn't about me or anything I'd done. It was about her. She was afraid. She had been hurt before, she wasn't ready, she couldn't risk stepping into a role she might fail at. Relief washed over me first, the kind that makes your chest feel lighter. This explained everything. The hesitation, the avoidance, the quiet tension that had shadowed every mention of my children. I tried to see her differently after that. I reminded myself that fear wasn't cruelty. That needing space didn't mean she didn't care. I told myself she loved me in the way she knew how, and that eventually, when she felt safe, she would meet the kids. It made sense, so simple it almost felt like the answer I'd been waiting for, but even as I convinced myself, little things began to gnaw at the edges of that relief. A line in the notebook hinted at memories she avoided, something tied to children, but she didn't describe it fully. There were gaps I couldn't fill, words that ended with ellipses or crossed-out phrases. I told myself it was just journaling quirks. But deep down, a tiny whisper insisted that this explanation, as comforting as it was, didn't tell the whole story. Later that evening, she smiled at me while we watched a movie, but her gaze drifted past me, towards the empty corner of the couch where my daughter sometimes sat. The warmth in her expression clashed with the words I'd read. I wanted to ask her about it, to bridge the gap between notebook and reality, but I didn't. Not yet. Not until I could be sure, I had answers, or so I thought. The notebook became my shield, my reasoning, my explanation for everything I had feared. But shadows lingered. I could feel them, faint, persistent, like footsteps I couldn't see behind me. And I had the creeping sense that one day, I would have to confront the truth that no notebook could ever fully explain. For a while, things felt easier. I told myself the notebook had answered my questions. She wasn't avoiding my kids out of dislike or malice, she was just afraid. And if fear was the problem, I could wait. I told myself patience would eventually turn that fear into acceptance, maybe even affection. I leaned into the quiet moments we had, letting the false sense of calm wash over me. We fell into routines again. Coffee on Sunday mornings, walks through the park, quiet dinners at home. I watched her laugh, I watched her smile, and I allowed myself to believe she really did care, even if she couldn't yet express it to my children. The notebook became almost sacred in my mind. I didn't question it. I didn't dig deeper. I thought I understood her, but then, small things started creeping back. A pause here, a frown there. One evening, I mentioned a funny story about my daughter's piano recital, and she flinched, her smile fading for a moment I could barely catch. Another time, she excused herself during a family phone call, claiming a sudden headache, though the sun was still high in the sky. The incidents were brief, subtle, almost easy to ignore, but I noticed, one night, as we were cooking together, she suddenly froze in front of the oven. Her hands hovered over the pan, trembling slightly. I stopped what I was doing. "Are you okay?" I asked. She nodded quickly, brushing it off with a small laugh. But the edge in her voice didn't match the words. I wanted to leave it alone, to trust the explanation I had convinced myself of, but the dissonance lodged in my chest. Even in the calm, a quiet doubt had started to take root. It was faint, like a low hum under the hum of daily life, but it never fully went away. I realized that fear could explain some things, but not everything. There were gaps, moments when her reaction didn't line up with what I thought I understood. I wanted to believe in the calm, to wrap myself in it and ignore the tiny cracks, but ignoring them felt like pretending I hadn't noticed the cold air seeping in between us, and so I did nothing. I waited. I hoped. I told myself patience was love, that eventually, everything would make sense. But the quiet unease remained, persistent and patient, lurking behind her practiced smiles. I could feel it growing, even as I told myself it wasn't there. I didn't realize it then, but this uneasy calm was just a pause, a deceptive lull before the truth would push its way to the surface. And when it did, I wouldn't have a notebook or patience to shield me. It started with a photograph. I didn't know why it caught my attention, maybe because it was out of place on the edge of the bookshelf, tucked behind an old frame. I pulled it out carefully, dust motes dancing in the sunlight, and froze. It wasn't of my kids, not of us, not of a moment I recognized. It was of her. Alone, sitting on a small wooden bench in what looked like a playground. But the expression on her face wasn't joyful. It was empty, hollow, like she was somewhere far away inside herself. I studied the picture, turning it over in my hands. Something about it. It felt charged, heavy. I felt a prickle on the back of my neck, a tight knot forming in my chest. I couldn't explain it. But I knew I needed answers. I asked her, casually at first, "Is this from your childhood?" She stiffened instantly, her fingers tightening around the edge of the frame. She gave me a half smile, forced, and muttered, "Just an old memory. Nothing important." But her voice trembled slightly, and the edges of that smile didn't reach her eyes. I could feel it, the part of her that wanted to retreat, that wanted to hide. I pressed further, gently, careful not to push too hard. She looked away, biting her lip, and for the first time, I saw it, real fear, but not the kind I had assumed. Not fear of failure or commitment. Fear of pain. Later that evening, she finally told me, haltingly, in fragments, about her past. About a family tragedy, one that involved a child she had loved like her own, a child she couldn't protect. The memories had haunted her ever since, shaping every choice, every instinct. Meeting my kids wasn't just intimidating. It was triggering. It forced her to confront memories she hadn't dared to face for years. That's why she avoided them. That's why she recoiled, why the notebook was only half the truth. I felt like someone had yanked the rug out from under me. Shock, guilt, confusion, sorrow, they all collided in my chest. I had thought I understood her. I had thought I was patient, kind, empathetic. But I hadn't seen this. I hadn't even imagined it. And now I did. The cracks in her facade weren't avoidance or fear of commitment, they were self-protection. And I realized, painfully, that my own assumptions had created distance between us. I had interpreted her actions through my lens, not hers. The journal, the hesitations, the pauses, they weren't rejection. They were walls she had built to survive. And all this time, I had been trying to tear them down without understanding why they existed. That night, I sat alone in the living room, the photo still in my hand, listening to the hum of the city outside. I felt the weight of the truth pressing down, heavy and relentless. I wanted to reach her, to hold her and tell her I understood. But I also knew I couldn't. Not yet. Not without giving her the space to confront her own shadows. For the first time, I realized how much I had misunderstood, not just her, but myself, my patience, my assumptions. And for the first time, I didn't know if love alone would be enough to bridge the gap that fear and past pain had carved. After she finally opened up, the apartment felt quieter, heavier, as if the air had shifted. I had known tension before, but this was different. This wasn't just confusion or fear, it was the weight of real pain, old and raw, layered over every interaction we'd had. I kept thinking about all the moments I'd misread, the pauses I'd judged, the assumptions I'd built into a story that wasn't hers at all. I tried to reach her that evening, gently, softly, offering words that might ease the tension between us. But she recoiled, small, fragile, almost like she could feel my presence as a weight. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't before: love wasn't enough. Patience wasn't enough. I couldn't make her face a past she wasn't ready to confront. I could only wait and hope, while also protecting my children from confusion or hurt. The fallout hit slowly. I found myself questioning everything, my judgments, my intentions, my own sense of empathy. I wondered if my insistence, my silent frustration over the months, had hurt her. Or if my interpretations, my mental narratives, had created tension that didn't need to exist. I hadn't known the truth, and in that ignorance, I had been unfair. My kids didn't understand why she wouldn't meet them. I didn't fully understand either, not until the photograph, the memories, the fragments of confession. And even now, with pieces of the truth. There were no neat solutions. Should I press for connection? Should I step back entirely? How do you balance love for someone with the loyalty and protection your children need? I kept thinking of that night in the kitchen, the way her hands trembled over the stove, the way her smile didn't reach her eyes, and I felt a deep, quiet grief. Not for her, but for all the misunderstandings, the assumptions, the lost time. For the patience I had misapplied, for the trust one thought I had but had been blind to. I don't know what comes next. I don't know if she will ever meet my kids, or if she can face the ghosts that keep her away. And maybe that's the hardest part, the uncertainty, the moral tension that has no clean resolution. I have love for her. I have love for my children. But the space between their worlds is filled with shadows I didn't understand until it was too late to be innocent about them. So I sit here, wondering, was I wrong to assume the worst? Did my insecurities hurt someone I love? Can trust ever be rebuilt after misunderstanding? And maybe the most painful question of all, how do you hold two kinds of love in your hands, when neither fits perfectly into the other? The apartment is quiet now. The city hums faintly outside. And I realize that sometimes, the hardest truths aren't about betrayal or lies, they're about the ways we misread each other, and the slow, careful work it takes to find understanding. Even if understanding doesn't bring comfort.